and it's nice to be with all of you today. As was noted live, it's so different than being remote on Zoom, and sometimes we have to do that, but when we have the opportunity to meet together, it's always fun and a good chance to be inspired to do the work that we are doing, because we support a pretty marginalized population in the Asia-Pacific region, which are children living with HIV. And so I'm going to give you a general regional perspective on the status of dispersible pediatric dolutegravir. For those of you who don't know what this is, it's a 5 or a 10 milligram tablet that dissolves in liquid and can be more easily given to infants and children. And so this is the branded version at the top on the right, and the generic, one of the generic versions at the bottom on the right. And we'll discuss some barriers and gaps to accessing these medicines in the region, and talking a bit about what providers in our research network, the Treat Asia Network, are doing to provide dolutegravir to children. So hopefully many of you are aware that in 2019, the WHO decided to harmonize all of the treatment recommendations to include dolutegravir for all ages, and including infants and children, when formulations were available and there were safety data. In 2021, following the availability of additional trial data from the Odyssey study, updated recommendations included the ability for providers to prescribe these dispersible formulations as long as you were over 4 weeks of age and over 3 kilograms. So that's the lower limit of what was allowed. And some basic information to put us kind of on the same page for the rest of the discussion is on what this is now being used for. So you can use adult dolutegravir. You could use it for adolescents as long as you were over 20 kilograms of age, so older children. But for younger children, now you can use it, this dispersible version, for infants up and children up to 20. So you're not supposed to use this pill for those over 20 kilograms. The innovator product is a 5 milligram tablet, and it comes in bottles of 60. The generic one is 10 milligrams, and it's scored, meaning you can split it into 2 5 milligram halves. It's a bottle of 90. Now, the lowest global fund price that we know of today is $4.50 a bottle. Now that might sound odd because most of us in this room could not buy this medicine at that low of a price. At the moment, there is one company that has WHO pre-qualification approval and US Food and Drug Administration tentative approval to market and sell this product through the global funder PEPFAR, and another company has WHO pre-qualification. That means there are 3 companies in the world today that can make and distribute dispersible pediatric dolutegravir to those kinds of countries, meaning countries that might use PEPFAR or Global Fund money to purchase these drugs. So there's a table there on the right-hand side, and it just gives you a sense of the fact that this is weight-band dosing. We recognize that it can be difficult to do a certain number of milligrams per kilogram of dose when you only have a tablet. So what's happening in terms of approvals of this drug for countries to use in the region? On the right, you see a table with the latest status of the registration, meaning that the country has these drugs registered for sales and use for patients in their country, and then the approvals, whether or not the registration was granted, and the inclusion in national guidelines for some of the countries in the Asia Pacific. So apologies if your country is not represented here. So globally, it's approved in 13 countries and supplied in 67 countries, and 2 countries in the Asia Pacific region have approvals of generic formulations. But you may not need an approval if your government allows you to procure this drug. That's why there's a mismatch in the top bullet between 13 and 67. So on the right side, you see in red are the countries where we have it approved and it's in national guidelines. And in the region officially, that's only Cambodia, India, Vietnam, a little bit in Thailand, and probably some other countries not on this list. So I'm going to go over the latest access data that we have, and we collected this a few months ago, so there may be some changes for some of the countries in the region. So in Cambodia, we know the generic 10 milligram is available at the end of the 3rd quarter of last year. So this is 2022. There were already 123 kids on it, and so we expect that by the end of this 1st quarter, there'll be a lot more. In Vietnam, they also have generic 10 milligram DTG, and they did this in phases. So the first time when they began switching, they switched 700 children who were stable on efavirenz, and they prioritized those with viral failure. So they have plans for 1,300 more children to switch, and I'm sure there are people in the room who could comment on whether or not they think they'll hit this target. There are smaller countries that can buy very small amounts of medicine for the few children living with HIV there. So Bhutan and Laos are those two countries, and at the end of last year, they bought a few bottles. So Bhutan is quite small, they only have a few kids with HIV, so they bought 60 bottles. But Laos bought 750 bottles, and they are already distributing this to children now. So what about those countries that are waiting for access? So India, the guidelines already say that you can switch to pediatric dolutegravir. It's already been recommended by their expert bodies. It's already in their guidelines. They have regulatory approval, but they do not have it yet in the government program. But you can go to a private pharmacy and buy it. You can even order it online and have it delivered to your home or your clinic, but not yet through the government program. So this is a barrier to families who cannot afford it. In Indonesia, although even the information we got from WHO was not fully updated, apparently it's been in the guidelines for 6 months already. It was discussed in December to create a national action plan, but that plan is not expected until 2 months from now, and they don't think, some of our colleagues don't think they're going to get it in the national program until the end of the year. In Malaysia, they don't have it in their national program either, and so what individual pediatricians have begun doing is negotiating directly with generic pharmaceutical companies to find out if they can put pressure on their national programs or procure the drug separately. So what are the barriers? I mentioned regulatory approval being one of them, but that is, and I'll get to that in a minute, but a big problem for us with all pediatric conditions, and the pediatricians know about this quite well, we don't need that many tablets. It's not like you're treating hypertension and you have 1 million people in your country who need a hypertension medicine. We're talking about small numbers of kids who need this, and their dosing may change over time. And as they get bigger and hopefully get fatter, they don't need the pediatric dose anymore. So there's not a commercial or a business case to make for companies to get these approvals. And so if that's the case, they're not going to make a lot of money. They just don't want to go through the hassle. And on the national program level, it just might not be a top priority because the burden of HIV is low, the numbers of infants with newly acquired vertically transmitted HIV are low. So this is a big barrier for us. And so I'm going to give you a specific example of how this is playing out, and that's the situation with Malaysia. So there are only about 500 children and young adolescents under the age of 15 living with HIV in the entire country. They were certified for elimination of mother-to-child transmission of HIV in 2018. So this is a photo on the right of Malaysian Minister of Health receiving the approval from Dr. Tedros. 5 babies acquire HIV in the entire country a year. And so that means, based on some back-of-the-envelope calculations by Dr. Nick at one of the hospitals in Kota Baru in Malaysia, about 100 to 150 kids could use pediatric dolutegravir. So he has to advocate to the national program, not just the HIV program, but the Ministry of Health, to make all these steps, follow all these steps, get all these approvals to treat 100 to 150 kids. And that number will get smaller every single year. So this is a tough thing to sell. And then for regulatory approval, you need staff at the company who can be dedicated to preparing the application for regulatory approval. And that may not just be in your country, because as we know, some of the commercial booths outside, they don't just represent Thailand. They may actually represent the whole, say, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. They have a portfolio of countries. And so for them to go ahead and do the regulatory approval paperwork takes a while. They may even hire local companies to facilitate this process. And so HIV is not their top priority. There's also money involved. To submit a dossier, that's what they're called, a dossier for registration approval, means you have to pay fees to the government. And the preparation of these dossiers costs money too, because these are often thousands of pages of legal documents. So what can we do now? So we should functionally look for pediatric dolutegravir and regular dolutegravir through alternate pathways, because this is the only way some of us are going to get this drug in the next 5 months, 10 months. We might have to wait a while. So this is why some people are now going to pharmacies to purchase them. As I mentioned, online purchase is a real thing. In fact, I was talking to one of our Indian colleagues, Dr. RT in Pune, and she texted her friend while we were on the phone who runs a private clinic, and she's like, how do you get pediatric dolutegravir? They texted back, I just ordered online and they deliver it to my clinic. And I thought, it's that simple? Really? And so we're now talking about the possibility of NGOs setting up buyers clubs for dispersible dolutegravir, just like we did at the beginning of the epidemic for all of our ARVs when we couldn't get them here. The next thing that we know is, I know you are doing this. You are taking the adult pills and you're breaking them and you're crushing them and you're mixing them in juice or something and you're giving them to your patients, because that's what we always have to do, sadly, even if there are not actually, they're not data for pediatric pharmacokinetics, as Tim Cressy reminded me, thank you, Tim, but there are data from adults. And so what they did was they extrapolated David Berger's study in adults, and he's kind of in the next room, I think, talking about this. They extrapolated his data to pediatrics. So in fact, this is still recommended in the PENTA guidelines and other guidelines that you are allowed to crush, to split and crush adult dolutegravir. But we are still having problem with getting adult dolutegravir. This is not something that is new. We were just talking to colleagues in Malaysia. They're struggling to get this because the price is still too high. And so if the supply is inconsistent, even if it's an adult tablet, you'll run into trouble. And so the cost in Malaysia right now as well for dolutegravir is about $100 a bottle. That's not nothing for families if they have to pay for that in low middle income countries in our region. So what else can we do? We can advocate. And I really think we as pediatricians, as pediatric HIV advocates, we can do that. We can go to our national HIV programs, our ministries of health, and to say, please help us. This is a very vulnerable population. We need your support to get them treatment. So a few other notes about splitting the pill. I mentioned that there are data about crushing the pill, and yes, there are, and it looks like, based on David Berger's team study, you have a slight increase in the concentration or the exposure of dolutegravir when you crush it, but it is okay. And I do want to note, though, that please remember the film-coated adult tablets are not, as it says up there, not bioequivalent to dispersible. That means that the maximum dose for a child is a certain number of milligrams, like 30 milligrams for a kid, and a maximum dose for an adult is 50. Now forget the BID dosing for a concomitant TB treatment, but just think, a baby doesn't need 50 milligrams to have a maximum dose. The bioavailability is different. So it is not the same, but it looks like this is reasonable for us, and this is probably the best data we're going to get for a little while. So I'm coming to the end of my comments now, and I think the reality is that we know there's a lot more reasons to not prioritize pediatric dolutegravir, more reasons to deprioritize it, to make it not important. And yet I believe we need to treat it like something that is more important than those reasons, more important than regulatory issues, more important than cost, is to optimize treatment for infants and children. And so in summary, just be reminded that the scale-up of quality assured, so pre-qualified or FDA approved pediatric dolutegravir in our region is really mixed. In Cambodia, it's no problem to get for kids. In Thailand, it's a big problem to get for kids, and Dr. Rangsimha will be speaking about what the government is doing now to address that. Some of us are using adult dolutegravir because we have to, and fortunately for us, it looks like this is probably safe, but it's not something we want to do forever. We actually want to have the proper formulation since it's available. And this image is of someone sort of trying to reach for a glass of water. In some areas of the world, pediatric dolutegravir is like water. It can be prescribed to any child who comes into your clinic, but not here. Not in Thailand, not in most of your countries. And so why is that? Why can't we just reach out and take it when the rest of the world can get it? So we need to work with the policymakers, with companies, to try to get those approvals and to bring the prices down. $4.50 a bottle is available under Global Fund. It is not available to Thailand. And you're going to hear about that next. So I want to thank Gitan Wairapam from Treat Asia, who is our community manager who put all these data together, and the pediatricians from the Treat Asia network who are in the photo on the right. Some of you are in the room, and those named here who help give us some background information on what's happening in their countries, and David Berger and Tim for their help with understanding bioavailability versus bioequivalence. Thank you.